Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar. This is our April webinar of 2023, and our topic today is going to be how to reduce your attack surface with device hardening. We're going to talk about the fundamentals of device hardening and what it actually means to implement that into your organization. My name is Madison Slater. I am the Executive VP of Security and Operations here at JSCM Group, and I'm excited to talk about this process with you. Um, as you might be aware, if you've attended any of our other webinars this year, we're approaching this year as a 12-part series focused on obviously security. But what we're doing is we're trying to break down the different concepts that we often run into or different pieces that can tie into having a more secure environment. Throughout the year, we're approaching these each as focused topics so that we can look at them as individual pieces that ultimately all tie together into a larger perspective. And again, this month we're going to be talking about device hardening. Now, device hardening itself is maybe not the most exciting of topics, but I do think that understanding its importance and your overall security is exciting because there are a lot of ways that this ties into some of the other areas that we've been discussing. So, like we enjoy doing, we want to start this conversation with a question. Now, last month we talked about authentication. We talked about implementing a strong authentication policy, having that in place to ensure that we're protecting ourselves without having things like compromised or easy to guess credentials. So let's say in that time you've implemented a strong authentication policy since the last webinar. And the question is, do you think that will stop hackers from getting into your systems? Now, the unfortunate answer to this is that we all probably assume no, right? Like authentication is a key piece of of security. We need to have it, but the reality is just having secure authentication does not stop the hackers from getting in, which is why we want to focus on device hardening. Now, before we really dive into the topic, I think it's important to really define what is device hardening. This is something that many of you might have heard before, the term device hardening or the concept of device hardening, but it can often be used in a very limited perspective. And the reality is that device hardening can come from a lot of different areas. It can come with several different ideas attached to it. Where we often get stuck when we talk about device hardening is that we're talking about it from a configuration standpoint, making sure that our devices are configured appropriately and making sure that we're doing things like installing good endpoint protection, making sure that we have secure passwords, things like that. But the reality is that device hardening actually can come from a couple of different avenues. Yes, configuration is going to be important for this, but it's not the only piece. When I think about device hardening, especially inside of my network here, I try to approach it from a couple of different aspects. And again, I like to ask myself questions. So one of the questions that I always ask myself is, how is it treated? When I'm talking about device hardening, how are we treating it? Um, One of the things that you can look at as being a piece of device hardening is how is it sitting on your network? Is this a device that is accessible by everyone, or is this a device that we have segmented off? The other thing that I like to ask myself is how was it used? So, is this a device that I need to have multiple people have access to? Is this a device that I need to have any type of uh, additional software or applications or anything like that? Or is this just going to be a regular end user machine? And the final thing is, again, that more specifically, that access, but not just who has access to it, what type of access do they need? Do we really need to give someone administrative level permissions on a device? Do they need to be able to make changes? When we are implementing device hardening, the reality is that while the topic itself might not be one of the most exciting, talking about configuring a device so that it's more secure, it does tie into the bigger picture. Device hardening, if we're not implementing this effectively inside of our network, we could be running into areas where we have increased exposure. So talking about some of the things that we've already gone through this year, if we're implementing things like good password hygiene, if we're implementing things like MFA, if we're moving more towards a zero trust uh, environment, yes, we are greatly improving our security. But if we're not making sure that the devices that we're using on our network are properly managed, are properly controlled, are properly hardened, then a lot of these other efforts can become much less effective. So again, while device hardening itself is maybe not as robust of a topic as some of the other things we've been covering, it is still important to make sure that we are not running into issues because of it. And again, I like to approach these webinars with stories and giving examples, and honestly, there are countless examples that I could give from this perspective. A recent situation that we were witness to was an organization that was hit pretty severely with ransomware. um, and while that in and of itself is bad, when you get hit with ransomware, if it is one that has encrypted your files, the big thing that you're trying to do is recover your database, right? Recover your data, which is why we always push backups. This organization was unable to do that. Why? Because the backups that they had were stored on a virtual device, a virtual server inside of their organization. That virtual server had not properly been hardened. So when the ransomware hit their network, it also compromised that device, which meant that they could not get access to their backups. That is a terrible situation to find yourself in. Um, Getting hit with ransomware again, that's bad enough. But then when you can't recover your backups, even worse. And why? Because the VM server that they were running was not properly hardened. It was not properly secured. It wasn't segmented off the network. It wasn't properly maintained from a security perspective as far as access and who had access and what type of access. So it was compromised. And again, countless examples of this. Another situation we had a client find themselves in, they had a breach because they had a publicly exposed server. That is actually included in device hardening. How is it accessed? Who has access to it? This server was not behind a firewall. It was not properly segmented from the rest of their network. So the server was compromised. Um, they use that as a jumping point into the rest of the organization. Device hardening is actually a very important piece in the overall process of securing our organization. So if we're not properly hardening our devices, then we are running into situations where that is not necessarily going to be as effective. Our security approach is not going to be as effective. Now, one of the things when we are talking about this is we are moving towards this better security and making sure that we're tying these together is understanding that leaving one piece off can overall impact our approach. Now, what happens if we don't implement device hardening? Again, we could have all of these other pieces that are tied in, but that one component, that one area, if we are leaving that piece weak, then we could, again, as the examples that I gave, give the opportunity for those attacks to happen. So, when do we need to start thinking about device hardening? When do we need to start thinking about this process? Well, honestly, before we ever plug it into the network. If you have a device that is going to be connected to your network in any way, it needs to be hardened before it is ever put on the network. Otherwise, we could be overlooking something very large scale. We could not know that it is not properly controlled. We could forget to go back and harden it. That is a thing that I hear more times than you would imagine when we point out devices that we have found in security assessments that were not properly hardened. You know what? I knew that, but I just forgot to go back and fix it. So before we even plug it into the network, we need to make sure that we're hardening our devices as much as possible. Now, to throw something a little bit new into this webinar, one of the things that we often come across when we are talking about device hardening, because this is something we've been pushing for years and years and years, it's a big piece of our security assessments, is that we are looking for devices that could be easily compromised because they were not properly configured. And one of the ones that we find on basically every security assessment are printers. Now, we always point these out and say you need to make sure that you're hardening your devices. But very oftentimes it will come back to um, we go back the next year or a couple of years later, and we're finding the exact same devices. Again, printers is the one that we often seem to find. Why? Because I think there's often a misunderstanding of why we are saying that. Printers are a big culprit in this, but uh, not just because we like to point out minuscule things. Printers can actually be an easy way for someone to compromise an organization, and we don't think about it because we think, it's a printer, it's not a big deal. So one of the things that I'm going to do a little bit differently this month that we haven't done in months previous is I want to show you a video. And this video might seem a little out of place. It might not, you might not quite understand why I'm tying it in, but I think once we get through it and you see the silliness of this, I'll sort of try to tie this together as to why I think this is an important thing for you to be aware of. So, as many people in IT are, I am surrounded by a lot of nerds, not just in my professional life, though. My husband is a big video game guy, and one of his favorite video games is Doom. And for any of you that have ever played it, it's been around for a long time. Doom, the original, dates back quite a while. It goes back uh, to the 80s, I believe. Don't worry, he'll correct me later if that was wrong. But pretty popular video game. And this video is from a conference several years ago that someone was demonstrating Doom. Okay, cool. Um, However, though, they were running Doom on a printer. So I know it's a little hazy, but if you notice, this is looking around the screen. That's the home button, and it's got some different buttons. This is a printer. This is the screen on a printer, and this guy hacked the printer in such a way that he is able to play Doom on it, and not just in black and white. It's got full color. Like that's not bad looking, right? Why is this important? Like, yeah, this is a cool thing for a hacker to be able to do, but more than anything, what this shows is that this was a device that in a lot of ways we might think doesn't really have anything pertinent on it. Now, being able to play Doom on a printer, no, that doesn't compromise a network. What they were trying to show, though, was that this was a device that was left, no one cared about it. It was left unattended, basically. It had not been properly secured. Playing Doom on the printer itself, that's not the point. The point is that these devices can be compromised. Now, why is compromising a printer really that bad? Well, if you think about what you're using your printers for, you're printing off information, you're printing off data, and we are sending that job to the printer most of the time, right? Like we're not running copiers anymore. We are running printers. So you're sending data to that printer, which means that that data is sitting on that printer. So printers, to point them out specifically, compromising one of them could mean that we have a data loss issue inside of an organization. If I gain access to a printer that wasn't properly hardened and it's got copies of recent jobs that were sent to it that I can just pull off of it, well, there we go. We've got a data leak. Printers can also often have contact information on them from not just our internal users, but if we have them set up where we can scan to email, there might be information in there pertaining to our customers or our clients. So all of that is to say that ensuring that we are hardening devices means that we are protecting ourselves from the accidental exposure. And hardening devices has to come at a level outside of just our computers and our servers. We have to look at it across the entire organization. So, how do we implement this into policy? Because again, that's really been the big focus of our webinar series is looking at policies, looking at ways that we can ensure that whatever things that we are trying to do are being enforced. So, when we're talking about device hardening from a policy procedure or process, I think there's a lot of different areas that we can add into this. One of the things that you can run into when we're talking about device hardening is inconsistency. And it's why we look at, when we're doing assessments, it's why we look down into devices like printers is that we're looking for the outlier. We're looking for the level of inconsistency where it's that one machine, it's that one device that you forgot to correct, because it's always that one that we can use as a way to get in. When we're talking about device hardening from a policy perspective, I think an important component is to consider ways that you can create consistency, that you can ensure that you don't have those areas in your organization that are being accidentally overlooked. Now, there are a couple of different ways that you can do that. One way that you can implement this, and again, having this outlined in a policy, is to institute some type of imaging tool. Now, what that allows you to do is create a standard. You can't image every single device on your network. Again, things like printers can be a little tough to image, but what this can allow you to do is create a baseline for things like your servers, things like your user endpoints, to ensure that you don't have an outlier. Imaging tools can be an easy way for you to roll out the other tools that you're using to enforce security. So things like your EDR solution. If you've got some type of endpoint protection, you can roll that out through your imaging tool to make sure that it's consistent across the board. If you're implementing things like MFA and you've got an application that needs to run on the device to ensure that MFA is there, you can implement that in your imaging tool. Imaging tools, again, the focus is consistency. Device hardening fails when we have the one device we forgot to harden. So by implementing things like an imaging piece, we can ensure that we've got a better level of control across the board. Another thing that your policy should specifically include for device hardening is referring to access hardening. So we've talked on and off throughout the year about things like least privilege, giving someone the least amount of privilege possible. That concept can be reflected in a bunch of different areas in your organization, down into things like your device hardening policy. Our devices should be hardened in such a way that you only have access if you need it. One of the things that can be effective here, and we have this written in our device hardening policy, is that we're not just going to grant anyone that asks for it administrative access over their machine. Our policy specifically states that no one will have administrative access unless they are on our tech side. And even then, we have clarification on what that access is going to look like. Hardening access is another piece of this. Again, it's not just making sure that you've got things like your endpoint protection running. It's making sure that whoever's on that computer is also hardened. Their access is hardened. Another piece of device hardening, and one that has been becoming more and more relevant over the last few years, is some type of MDM solution. Mobile device management is a good way for you to harden devices because through that, you can enforce certain policies and processes. A popular one right now, one that we use, is Microsoft Intune. Intune gets rolled out to all of our mobile devices, and what that allows us to do is enforce policies on those devices that pertain to access to our 365 data. So we can enforce hardening at the device level, but we're also enforcing it at the data level and at the access level. MDM solutions also give you the ability to more easily roll out hardening across the environment. So if you decide at some point, maybe right now you're not running MFA and next month you're going to be implementing it, having an MDM solution can give you the capability of rolling that out more effectively. And again, talking about things like imaging tools, the more consistency you can build, the better your hardening process and policies will be, the more effective they will become. And another piece of device hardening, and honestly one that can get overlooked or maybe not necessarily associated to device hardening, is understanding what does your inventory look like? What devices do you have? Because if you don't know what devices you actually have on your network, if you don't understand what you are actually dealing with, how do you know what devices might need to be hardened? I would actually, if if I was talking to one of you and maybe you're saying like, yeah, we don't really have an effective device hardening process or policy, and I need to know where to start. This would probably be the first place that I would tell you to begin. Is first you need to know what's there. You need to know what your devices are. You need to know what you've got running. Otherwise, you're not going to need to know what you need to protect. So having a device inventory gives you the ability to see what you have, and from there you can take the steps to start implementing that hardening process. Um, with device inventory, this also gives you the ability to start looking at things like the opportunity to implement better network segmentation. If you see all of your devices and you say, okay, all right, I've got 100 devices on my network, um, 15 of them are IoT devices. Well, maybe this is a good time for me to start also looking at ways to harden that access so I can start implementing things like some network segmentation. Also gives you the ability to more easily, I think, visualize what does that administrative or permission access look like. So if you've got devices across your network and you have it mapped out and you say, okay, here are all the devices that I actually have, you can again start looking at it more from the perspective of, okay, if these are the actual machines, endpoints, whatever it is, who needs access to them? What type of access do they need? Do I have situations where someone has administrative privileges on their machine that maybe they don't need? The best time to start implementing device hardening is the next time you have to set up a new computer, or you're rolling out a new printer, or you're installing a new Apple TV or Chromecast. That's when you can start implementing this process. To fully correct device hardening, you would need to gather all the machines in your network, probably wipe half of them, and start over and redeploy. And that's not really effective. It's not conducive to carrying on day to day business. So look at it from the perspective of, well, what can I do next? Having that device inventory can give you the visible output of what your network connection looks like as far as what devices are there. But you can start this process also just by saying, okay, the next time I'm going to be setting up a computer, I'm gonna start with an imaging tool. Maybe you don't have the ability to do an imaging tool, so you're at least going to start with some type of checklist. That's how you start to implement device hardening. But again, don't think of it just from the configuration standpoint. You have to think of it from the access standpoint as well, from the utilization standpoint, and start looking at ways that you can enforce that across the board instead of individually by computer or by machine. As we go through this year, again, we're talking about a lot of different pieces of security. Device hardening is just one part of it. And again, it might not be the most exciting of all the conversations that we're having this year, but still an important piece. It's a piece, not the entire answer to the puzzle, honestly, because security is a journey, not a destination. We will not get a secure network by one thing. If you go through, and again, let's say you have the ability, you gathered all of your machines and you hardened them all, and then you'd redeployed them out, you've only done one part of it. And it's why we're approaching this from the perspective of having a lot of different pieces that are tied into our organization, having policies that are written so that we have it formally documented as far as what we're going to be doing and how we're going to be enforcing it. That's how we finally start to move towards having a more secure environment. But at no point should we ever assume that we're going to reach the end. There isn't an end. Things will change. The hardening processes, even if you have them today, you should reevaluate them because those change. Security changes, so we have to make sure that we're staying on top of it. Again, much like any of our other webinars this year, we're not just going to talk to you about a concept and then leave you hanging. Next steps as far as this month, we do have a couple of things that we want to provide you. One is a device hardening policy template. So if you are working on an information security policy book, we do have a template that you can grab to give you a starting point for device hardening. It is definitely one, I will say, we are starting pretty simple. That is one that absolutely will need to be expanded based off of your organization, but it can at least give you a starting point. And like I've said in our other webinars, if you are working towards implementing policy, you need to make sure that it's implemented at an organizational level. If you don't have buy-in at the organizational level, then it's not going to be effective. If any of you are watching this webinar and you do not happen to be in IT, you are actually the people, if you are a decision maker, you are the people that we in IT need on our team. We need you backing us up with writing these policies. We need the enforcement at the organizational level, or we've just got a nice piece of paper sitting on our desk or stored in our files that isn't getting followed. The other thing that we want to make sure to provide are some device hardening guides. So these are not created by us. These are CIS documents. There are a couple that we've grabbed. There are tons more out there. And really, what these are designed to do is to give you a benchmark for hardening different environments, different systems. The ones that we have available are related specifically to Windows operating, but there are tons of them out there. There are device hardening benchmarks about things like Chrome. So if you're a Chrome organization and you want to harden that browser, CIS benchmarks are a great starting point. They can be deep. They can have a lot of information in them. So you might have to parse through some of it, but it's at least giving you some, a place to start and to grow from. Throughout the year, we're working towards implementing and helping you implement some of these different policies. We went through this last year. We continue to go through this. We did our SOC 2 audit last year. There were things that we had to create. We didn't have them. But again, just putting them on paper doesn't do anything. We have to then make sure that we're following those. So, we're trying to use this year as a way to share our experiences and also give you some tools for yourself and for your organization to improve. So, as we continue throughout the year, we're building up to larger and larger conversations. But I do think that each of these topics that we're talking about stand pretty strongly on their own as well. So next month in May, I'm actually really excited about this one. This is going to be our vulnerability testing discussion, and there's tons and tons of stuff that we can talk about related to vulnerability testing. So I hope that you will join us for our May webinar. Really appreciate you taking time to view this webinar, and hopefully this gives you some ideas if device hardening was not something you necessarily had on your radar. At least put it on your to-do list. But again, if you are truly, pushing towards more secure processes in your organization, policies, they are a good way to start. You have to make sure that you've got enforcement processes in place, but at least having it written down and having that outline, that will help get you there. You've got to have your guide first, then you can follow it. Thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it. We hope you can join us for next month. If you haven't viewed any of our other webinars, they are also posted on our website, so you can go back and watch those. Excited to talk to you in May about vulnerability testing and our future webinars as well. Thank you so much, and we will talk to you next month.